Hey folks, this has been 5 months in the making, but we finally are able to create our Fury scene that we've been working on since last December. This is the Fury. This is the famous tiger. I made this one historically accurate rather than so much movie accurate. Why don't we see how we do this? I'll show you a trick or two. I hope to inspire you to create your own diorama, get you out of a rut, just give you some new techniques and tips and tricks to try out on your next diorama. Or maybe you haven't done a diorama before and you're just interested to learn to do your first one maybe. And hopefully I can help you out with that today. Let's get to it, shall we? Alrighty folks, so to start off we're going to take these 3D printed bases that I made and we're going to be applying some smart mud from VMS. This stuff is really nice for making a nice base because it is essentially like a grainy clay or like a sticky sand maybe. So you're going to want to wear gloves when you apply this stuff just because it is very sticky. There's a little bit of moisture to it and it goes down like an acrylic. So as you're putting this stuff in place, you want to make sure whatever you're using to handle it is kept dry or else it'll stick to you. So in this case I'm using my gloves, and when I say I'm using my gloves, I'm using like the outer edge, the inner sides, I mean, everything you can that's dry, because it'll get wet pretty quick. And then as you put this down, you might have a few frillies on the side you can knock off, but you can see how well it goes down on these two bases, and it doesn't take too long. It's very nice, and it will dry rock hard, but before we let it dry, we want to add a few impressions. So we're going to take the Tiger and the Sherman and we're going to use the tracks that are already on the tank and just press them into place. If you need to add a little bit more mud down to make sure that you get a nice thick track, you go ahead and do that, get a nice track imprint. You can also use spare tracks for this step as well, which is really nice. And then the next step is I'm going to put some rocks down using some ballast. So the first thing I'm using here is just some coarse ballast. And then we'll mix in some medium or fine ballast as well. And this just gives us a nice rocky texture in that mud. And I'm going to press it down with my glove. And then we're actually going to come later and put some diluted PVA glue to make sure they stick down. Before we do that though, we're going to use some of these larger stones and just put these in place. These are just some larger rocks I want to add into the scene to make it a little bit more visually appealing. And here we can see the diluted PVA glue that I'm just using a dropper to apply. This is going to hold all those loose rocks and stuff in place. Now the next step here is putting some grass tufts down. So these are some grass tufts that I actually found on Amazon. They're essentially pre-glued grass tufts, and you can just use a little bit of white PVA and set them in place. Same thing with this little thing of flowers as well, a little tuft of flowers, because the scene is taking place in May, so we would have some flowers out. Some more tufts of grass and weeds and things like that. Now, if you're familiar with the movie, you'll notice that this is a little bit different, and what I'm doing is trying to make it a little bit more visually appealing than simply putting it in a plowed field as it was in the movie, which would just be a bunch of mud and nothing else. So we're adding in a few plants, a few rocks, and what I'm doing here is actually making holes for some of the rounds that the Shermans that were firing at the Tiger essentially would have like kind of flopped in front of the tank, the ones that missed and hit too short or maybe bounced off. So just making some holes to start while that smart mud is soft. Now the next step is I'm going to be putting down some grassy patches. So you can kind of experiment at this step if you want to. What I found is mixing a little bit of water in with some PVA glue to make it diluted but not too watery was a really nice medium, something that you could apply with a pipette as you saw me do there, and you can kind of get a patchy look. Now that white glue will dry clear, so you will not see it later, but here you just to give you another example of how you can kind of just throw this stuff down anywhere and it will look really good in the end. And next step is to actually just use the static grass applicator, which again I got on Amazon. It's a real cheap one. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. Just apply that static grass and knock it off. And then another trick I like to do is take the airbrush and blow off all the excess while it's still drying, and that leads to some pretty nice patchy grass results. Now the other thing I wanted to do is, this is kind of like an open field, was to maybe put a few corn stalks that maybe just found their way into this area, got drug here, taken, I don't know, either way, just add a few other visual details. I also wanted to put some leaves on the back side of the tiger because it was coming up out of like a hollow or woods in the movie. So you can see we have a lot of our pieces in place here, and we actually have a nice scene coming together with lots of visually appealing things to look at this point. But there was one thing I just wanted to add yet, which was some grass tufts that are really tall. So these are like your tall weeds, maybe from the season before, that kind of grew up and died. This was something that was in the scene in the movie as well, so I wanted to include that. Again, I know it's not exactly like the scene in the movie, but it's, as I said in the beginning, movie inspired. So after masking off the sides, I then got this thing ready to paint, but I realized at this step that I actually had forgot to put the mud down along the edges of the tracks. So looking back to my T3485 diorama that I had done, where it was a real muddy mess, kind of the spring thaw. If you didn't see that video, I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description for you guys. But you can see I'm doing pretty much the same as I did in that video, where I'm just putting down some acrylic mud along the edges of where the track imprints are, using those track imprints as a guide to where the mud would kind of get pushed out by the weight of the tank as it's going across this muddy ground, or just damp ground, right? Because these tanks are many tons in terms of weight, so that mud is going to naturally push out from the sides when it goes over any kind of soft terrain, such as an open field like this. And I did the same thing around the shell impacts there, just put a little bit of like mud to make it look like it kind of got pushed up a little bit when the rounds would have hit in front of the tank. So you can see we have some really nice textures down on this base. Now it may be a smaller base, similar to like a vignette, and there's nothing super vertical in these, but it really adds a lot of visual texture, and it'll make our tanks feel like they're sunken into the bases to make them, you know, feel like you can see the weight, you can see the mass of these things on these bases. So the next step is to primer everything in black. Now I know some may be thinking, why would you primer it? But look at the difference. Look at what we have to work with if we primer it first. We can also bring out those beautiful textures. We can see that comparison before and after, just to see what it looks like. But look at the textures when we paint it black. We can really bring out those textures, which makes it a lot easier for us to paint all of these beautiful textures and make them a little bit better than what they are just stock out of the bag or box that you get them in. So just showing off all those wonderful textures. I love this stage, whether it's a tank, any model, or a base. When it's primered in black and you can see all the textures you have as your canvas to paint, it's a beautiful sight. So at this point, we're going to do what might seem backwards. You would think that you'd want to paint all the earth tones first, but it's actually easier to paint all your details with your airbrush first, because the overspray is going to hit the ground, and then we'll cover that up with the earth later. So the first thing I'm doing is taking a Dunkelgelb color, which is just a dark yellow, and I'm painting the bases of the grass and the tufts and the weeds to essentially act as like roots, or maybe some dry grass that's underneath. And I'm also using the same color on the stalks as well, just to show that dried out, dead look. And especially on these tall grass tufts near the rocks, again, these would be like dead grass tufts. Very Dunkelgelb, dark yellow color. Next I'm using bright green, and I'm coming in from the top rather than the bottom, as I was doing with the yellow. And then what this is doing is bringing the greens out on the tops of all of our grass and our tufts. And what it does is it keeps the yellows underneath, so you get a little bit of a mix of yellow, and then you're adding in the green to give it a more natural look. And if you ever look at pictures of grass, you'll always see random blades of yellow and green, bright green, dark green, yellow, and you'll see all sorts of different shades, and that's kind of what we're trying to do here. Now on any of these grass tufts and flowers, we're going to make sure we hit that green pretty good. And if you take notice, what I'm doing here is I'm actually coming back with some bright green mixed with yellow, and I'm specifically hitting the centers and the tops of the grass tufts, and mostly the centers of the grass patches as well, almost as if you're post shading grass. So essentially you're focusing on the centermost areas of the grass, and what that does is it kind of creates fake shadows along the edges, and it makes it look more voluminous, like there's more volume than what there really is there. Voluminous, is that? I always forget the word. Either way, you can see it really well here. I did a little bit of a cloudy pattern, but you can see how just doing a few highlights in there inside your grass patches is going to really bring in the depth and volume and create those fake shadows, which is where you're going to get that realistic look, because when your eye sees that and it sees the depth and it sees the different colors, then your eyes think that it's real. And that's what we're going for here in this scenic base, is something that looks real, or at least as real as we can make it look. The other nice thing about having the greens around the rocks is that the green on the bottom of the rocks can almost act like a moss. So then when you cover it up with this grayish color, which in this case I used a gray violet, which looks really, really natural I think at this scale, you can just hit it from the top so you don't eliminate those shadows or any of the little bit of green overspray on the bottom of the rocks, and it actually looks more natural, as if there's moss or some other kind of plant growing on the bottoms of those rocks. And look at that depth you're getting. Remember, there's no earth tones in here, but you can see all the different shades of yellows and greens. Now this next step, I will admit, is something I really stumbled across. It's not something I've ever seen done, but I tried it once, again on that T3485 diorama, and it really worked out well, so I wanted to just repeat that here. And that is using enamel earth effects from ammo and actually airbrushing them on. Because what happens is you use that black undertone that you painted with the primer, and what you're doing is you're essentially creating highlights around the bushes, highlights on these upper areas, but in the recessed areas that wash doesn't eliminate the shadow. So essentially your raised edges become highlights and your recessed areas stay as shadows, and you're only using one color. So this is after one pass of enamel earth effects with an airbrush. You can see how we have natural shades depending on where we were spraying at. Like where the tank tracks are, it stays nice and dark, and around the plants, because of the overspray, it actually gives us some highlights, which again makes it look more natural. And then what I usually do is at least add one more coat of the plain earth effects, and then I move on to any other colors I want to add in the earth. So in this case, I'm using wet mud over the part of the tracks that is the mud coming up out, and then I used damp earth everywhere else. So in a kind of a cloudy pattern, or maybe cleaning up any edges, making the contrast a little bit softer around the earth tones, I actually used the damp earth effect enamel to add in there. So there's essentially three different enamels used there. So after the airbrushing is done with the earth tones, now we put the airbrush away and we get out the brush, and what I'm doing here is just painting the rocks with a bunch of different colors of gray tones that are green, gray tones that are brown, gray tones that are light gray, just all sorts of different gray tones as if you'd see in real rocks. And when you do that across your entire base, all of a sudden those little pieces of ballast that we laid down earlier become a nice landscape feature showing all those little rocks. Next up, we have those leaves that we put down behind the tiger, and I'm just going to use some rust tones on these leaves to make them look like they are last fall's leaves that are just left over in the mud and the dirt. Because if you look in the early spring, you typically will see some leaves left over from the year before. And again, I'm just using different colors of rust tones, and they just really make these little leaves stand out very, very, very nicely on the background. So here we can see we have plenty of things to look at on this base, but we need to put our subjects in place. So in this case, we're going to put down our tanks, and what you're gonna have most times, and this is okay, you might have little gaps here and there from when you put your mud down. So what we're going to do is take the same exact acrylic mud, and we're going to put that in place and fill in these gaps. And then what I did next was just took some enamel damp earth colors and just put that over top of the mud that we had just applied to give it the same color. And here's the results of that. It makes it look like the tank's actually down in the mud, creating that mud that's coming up on the sides due to the weight of the tank. I did the same thing on the Tiger as well. Now I wanted to address the foliage on the Tiger, so what I did was I found this plant called baby's breath, and I got some that was already dried out, and I just removed the bulbs off the end. It's a very small flowery plant. And then I took some paper that I just painted with some random green tone colors, and I punched out some leaves and applied them onto the little branches, and what we get is some very realistic looking leaves in comparison to at least the bushes that were on there before. So with that out of the way, we can take off those ugly bushes that I got in some variety pack of moss filling stuff, and we're gonna apply these branches down in place, and I think it looks so nice with realistic looking branches on that Tiger. I really think that that does the little bit of branch, the foliage, some justice. Now, the last step here is we got to put on our faceplates. So thank you for someone in the comment section that actually let me know, hey, a good idea on the name of these. So we have Hell Hath No Fury, Like a Tiger Scorned. This is just such a great combination of nameplates to go with a combo diorama. So once we had those painted up in brass and then blacked the letters out, super glued it fast to the base of this, and we have this wonderful looking diorama to enjoy. Well folks, that's going to be it for today. Did you learn anything new? Perhaps you found some inspiration? If so, hit that like button, and remember, build your models, not just your stash. The process may seem overwhelming, but as you practice, you'll get better at it. I do have another project lined up for you all. It'll be a 16th scale M10 tank destroyer. I have a special surprise in store for that gigantic build, so don't forget to subscribe or you'll miss out on that future content. If you'd like to see how I built and painted the subjects of this diorama, which do have full interiors, be sure to check out the links in the description or head on over to my channel page to check those out. I'd like to give a special shout out to my patrons that support my work. If you're interested to learn more about modeling or want more in-depth content, be sure to check out my Patreon. It's like a personal magazine subscription with high-definition photos from my workbench and deep insight to my thoughts and processes. You can also have access to my library of printable tools and parts as well, and check out my personal reference photos. See you next time.